Machiavelli is often seen as a villainous figure in history, and not without reason. He challenged conventional moral values, rejected Christian principles, and questioned goodness at its core. Instead of traditional virtues, Machiavelli created a structured system where cruelty and deception were legitimate tools for the conquest and maintenance of power. His thought presents a complex web of contradictions, profound truths mixed with the justification of ruthless acts and unshakable determination. However, upon closer examination of his philosophy, beyond his controversial reputation, we can find disturbing yet relevant reflections on the workings of the modern world and how to navigate it. To fully understand Machiavelli's ideas, it is necessary to examine his life and the historical context in which he lived. Born in 1469 in Florence, Machiavelli lived in a time of great political instability and social unrest. His family was of noble origin, but his father, Bernardo Machiavelli, although well-connected, was the poorest member of his lineage, a failed lawyer who was often unemployed. Despite his connections, Bernardo had little practical influence. The religious skepticism of his father contrasted with the deep devotion of his mother, who wrote hymns and poems, significantly shaped Machiavelli's worldview, providing him with a critical and pragmatic perspective from an early age. At that time, Florence presented itself as a republic with a theoretically democratic government. The city's administration was made up of 8 priors, headed by a sort of prime minister. These leaders were elected every 2 months by a lottery, where only the most respected and successful men in the city had their names on the list. This structure aimed to ensure a constant rotation of power, preventing any one group from dominating. However, in practice, the system was highly dysfunctional. The frequent changes of leaders resulted in erratic policies and a lack of continuity. It was then that the powerful Medici family intervened, manipulating the lottery so that their allies were always in power. Thus, while Florence was officially a republic, it actually functioned as a disguised dictatorship. Wars in Italy were less frequent than in the rest of Europe, but they still occurred. While other countries fought for territories, Italian rulers preferred to hire mercenaries, changing alliances depending on the opportunities. In this context, Machiavelli grew up in a society where real power was disconnected from appearances. From a young age, he witnessed disorder and corruption. At the age of 9, he saw how conspirators against the Medici were hanged upside down in front of the government palace and left there to rot for weeks. A clear message of the political brutality of the time. These events deeply marked Machiavelli and influenced his future thinking. Although details of his youth are scarce, it is known that Machiavelli received a good education. With the expulsion of the Medici in 1494, he entered the Florentine government, drafting official documents. By the age of 28, he already held the position of Secretary of the Second Chancellery and of the Ten of War, a committee responsible for foreign relations and defense. His rise was meteoric, although it is still unclear how he achieved such positions. Many downplay his political role, claiming he failed. But this view is unfair. For over a decade, Machiavelli was the most important diplomat in Florence, a weak state in a turbulent time. In 1512, the Florentine Republic fell and the Medici regained power. Accused of conspiracy, Machiavelli was imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately exiled. It was during this exile that he wrote his most famous work, The Prince. This book, conceived as a manual for rulers, was addressed to Lorenzo de' Medici, Machiavelli broke with traditional political philosophy, which valued goodness and morality as criteria for greatness. For him, the essential thing was to maintain power, even if that required cruelty or deception. He did not deny morality, but argued that a ruler could not always be moral if they wanted to be effective. His analysis, cold and precise, dismantled idealistic illusions about power. An emblematic case was that of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. To control the city of Cesena, Borgia delegated command to his lieutenant Ramiro de Lorca, giving him freedom to act with brutality. Lorca imposed a regime of terror, public executions, confiscations, and extreme punishments. Over time, hatred towards Lorca began to extend to Borgia. To safeguard his image, Borgia ordered Lorca's execution, displaying his mutilated corpse in the public square. He then declared that Lorca had acted on his own, distancing himself from the crimes. This maneuver, cold and calculated, exemplifies the tactics that Machiavelli admired. Power demands pragmatism, even at the cost of morality. Borgia portrayed Orco as a sadistic madman who had betrayed everyone's trust, justifying his execution as a necessary measure to protect the city. With cunning and coldness, Borgia positioned himself as the savior of the population, cleaning his own image at the expense of one of his most loyal allies. In his work, the Prince Machiavelli expresses deep admiration for Cesare Borgia, whom he considers the perfect example of leadership. While Machiavelli acknowledges the value of goodness, he stresses that, in order to be an effective leader, it is not possible to be good all the time. For him, politics is like a constant battle, where cruelty and ruthlessness often become indispensable. According to Machiavelli, a leader cannot limit themselves to compassion, loyalty, humanity, or honesty. The exercise of power often demands the opposite: to be cruel, disloyal, inhuman, and at times dishonest. Machiavelli raises a crucial question: is it better to be loved or feared? Although he acknowledges that it would be ideal to be both, he argues that, in practice, it is safer to be feared. People, according to him, are fickle and unpredictable. Some are cowardly, others are liars, many can be corrupted or easily change their minds, regardless of how much they claim to love a leader. However, fear is constant. The threat of punishment is a tangible tool that keeps people under control. Love can disappear, but fear remains. Changing people's way of thinking is a much harder task than inspiring fear. Machiavelli believes that while love is beyond a leader's control, fear can be manipulated. However, he warns about a delicate limit. Fear is useful, but hatred must be avoided at all costs. Hatred, he argues, generates conspiracies and assassinations. If violence is necessary, it should be applied quickly and discreetly to avoid generating resentment among the people. The ideal leadership for Machiavelli consists of being loved whenever possible, feared when necessary, but never hated. Machiavelli did not hesitate to abandon honesty when necessary, although he recognized that being honest is an admirable virtue. He argued that honesty is often impractical for those who wish to maintain power. For Machiavelli, a clever leader who outsmarts their adversaries with intelligence and strategy is far more effective than one who insists on always being truthful. Lying, breaking promises, deceiving, and even betraying are acceptable tactics in his view. Circumstances constantly change, and a leader must be flexible enough to adjust their commitments according to the situation. While this may not be ethical, It is what Machiavelli considers essential for the maintenance of power and the strengthening of a nation. Machiavelli also questions the obligation to be truthful with others, considering that people will inevitably lie to you. Being always honest, according to him, would be like giving an advantage to your enemies by refusing to use a weapon that they will surely use. This disregard for honesty is further reinforced by his belief that a leader does not actually need to possess virtues, but only appear virtuous in order to gain the admiration of the people. Machiavelli states that two elements are necessary: a convincing image and concrete results. Most people, he says, only know the leader by their words and appearances, and rarely have access to what happens behind the scenes. Therefore, the public judgment will be based on the perception they have of him, not on a deep understanding of his actions. His words should appear to be inspired by virtues, because this is how the public will judge him. At the same time, his actions will be evaluated based on the results achieved, not by the methods used. As Machiavelli suggests, honesty is not always enough to guarantee those results. Virtue, or any other moral quality, is not what defines the game of power. Thus, Machiavelli's legacy is born, or at least the reputation that made him so famous. His vision is not intrinsically cruel, but rather open to the possibility of being cruel when necessary, willing to lie, deceive, and hurt in order to achieve his goals. The essence of this stance is what many would call cynicism, but what Machiavelli preferred to consider as realism. In several passages of his works, he asserts that people are, by nature, selfish, dishonest, and unreliable. Therefore, in order to survive in that environment, the leader must be equally shrewd. However, limiting Machiavelli to this simplistic view would ignore the deeper, more uncomfortable truths that he exposed. Machiavelli also notably rejected Christianity as a solution to the challenges of life. In The Prince, he writes with disdain, "I see that many people have believed, and still believe, that the world is governed by God and fortune, and that no matter how clever men may be, they can do nothing to change this or protect themselves." With these words, he almost ridicules the idea that human destiny is in the hands of God, in a way. This view could be considered inspiring. You have control over your own life, not a divine force. Therefore, do something with that control. Machiavelli's approach is always practical and direct, and his reflections go beyond politics, encompassing life itself, which he sees as a constant struggle between virtue and fortune. Throughout The Prince, he resorts to the concept of virtue, which at first glance might seem synonymous with goodness. However, that would be a mistaken interpretation. Machiavelli was not interested in a simple distinction between good and evil, but rather in the pursuit of success instead of failure, and the need for strength instead of weakness. The concept of virtue in Machiavelli's thought has no exact translation, but it can be understood as a combination of qualities that allow one to achieve their goals. It can include talents such as courage, audacity, intelligence, cunning, or any other necessary skill to ensure success. In a broader sense, virtue represents the ability to act, to exercise control over one's own destiny. With this characteristic, according to Machiavelli, it is possible to achieve true greatness. This strength, however, is in constant confrontation with fortune, which for Machiavelli symbolizes luck, chance. He suggests that fortune decides half of what happens in our lives, while the other half is defined by our virtue. Machiavelli uses the metaphor of a river that, when it overflows, destroys a town and its people. This event represents fortune. However, He argues that we can mitigate the effects of this fate by building dams and levees, preparing to face the unpredictability. Essentially, fortune only exerts control where we allow it to. Preparing, often through fear, is the key to being ready when luck changes. Machiavelli warns that a successful strategy today can fail tomorrow, as fortune is fickle. True skill, therefore, lies in the ability to adapt. For him, it is essential to adjust your actions as circumstances change, adapt or perish. Additionally, Machiavelli recognized the existence of an instinctive nature within the human being. He believed that, beneath the moralities we practice or preach, there is a hidden beast that seeks to satisfy its desires at any cost. In a way, he was ahead of his time, as the psychologist Carl Jung would later conceive a similar idea, calling it the shadow, while Freud would refer to this phenomenon as the subconscious. Like these thinkers, Machiavelli argued that we should not repress this inner beast, but neither should we let it take control. The key is to learn to work with it, using its strength in our favor. Always be ethical, kind, and just when possible. However, when pursuing a goal, adopt the stance of a beast. Act like a lion whose imposing presence scares away the hyenas, and like a fox, clever enough to escape the traps. Strictly following laws, morality, and human customs may take you far, but only to a certain point. Machiavelli offers us an intriguing reflection when addressing the difference between the world as it should be and the world as it really is. This distinction, I believe, is one of the most frightening and accurate of his teachings. He warns us about the abyss that separates these two realities. If you behave based on an idealized vision of the world, ignoring how it actually works, you are walking toward your own ruin. Machiavelli asserts that the world is not a utopia. Yes, there are positive aspects, but it is far from being entirely good. Lies, traps, and dangers lurk, and it is necessary to be prepared to face them. With resilience, by living according to the world as it is, and not as we think it should be, we strengthen our chances of surviving and prospering. In my opinion, this point is the essence of Machiavellian philosophy, beyond any categorization of evil or villainy. However, when attempting to apply these principles to reality, some difficulties arise. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a gift. For Lorenzo de' Medici, the leader of the powerful Medici family, it was an attempt to regain their favor and trust, and ultimately secure employment. It is worth remembering that Machiavelli did this after being imprisoned, tortured, and exiled by the Medici themselves. However, he never got the job. Lorenzo, it seems, never even read The Prince, and even if he had, it is likely that Machiavelli would not have obtained the desired position. Machiavelli understood that his ideas, although brilliant on paper, might only have value for literature and not for politics. His work, defending concepts like deception, betrayal, cruelty, and opportunism, ends up sabotaging itself. Who, in their right mind, would want someone with these beliefs in their inner circle? How can one trust someone who advocates for such antisocial and potentially destructive behaviors? His principles, when exposed, become tools of isolation. By promoting his ideology, Machiavelli seems to have sacrificed his own acceptance. Who would read The Prince and desire the company of Machiavelli? The answer is clearly almost no one, although one might argue that it would be wiser to have him as an ally rather than as an enemy. His political career never reached a significant level of power. He did not draft revolutionary constitutions, lead uprisings, or govern cities or nations. Despite theorizing about power and politics, Machiavelli never demonstrated great skill in applying his own ideas effectively. In fact, there is no evidence that he ever practiced anything genuinely Machiavellian in his life. Of course, it is possible that he acted with such cunning and discretion that his actions went unnoticed by history. However, the records do not favor him much beyond his role as an author. After the failure of The Prince, he moved away from grand political ambitions and focused on a life more centered on personal pleasures. Machiavelli got involved in various love affairs and found immediate success writing romantic and satirical plays. Still, his true desire was always to return to politics. Eventually, Machiavelli was called upon by a distant member of the Medici family to advise on a potential conflict between France and Spain. His mission was to oversee the defenses of Florence. However, when the Spanish army approached, they simply surrounded the city and opted to sack Rome without facing much resistance. The fall of the Medici happened once again, and Machiavelli fell out of favor, becoming unemployed and without influence. He fell ill and soon after died, ending his life without ever attaining the political recognition he so longed for. Although his political career was relatively irrelevant, Machiavelli's impact on history remains undeniable. His writings, particularly The Prince, left a deep mark. Published only after his death, the book soon caused controversy. An English cardinal even claimed that the work had been written by the finger of Satan, and Pope Paul IV quickly banned it. In France, during the tumultuous period of conflicts between the Protestant Huguenots and Catholics, the country was under the rule of Charles IX, a young and sickly king. However, the true power was held by his mother, Catherine de' Medici, an Italian from Florence and the daughter of Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom the prince had originally been dedicated. In 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre resulted in the deaths of thousands of Huguenots, and Catherine was blamed for the bloodbath. Jean Delaunay, one of the few survivors, wrote a book that consolidated the image of Machiavelli as a villain. He portrayed Catherine as a devout reader of Machiavelli's works and presented the author as the epitome of cruelty and Italian malice. This distorted interpretation of Machiavelli's writings quickly spread, and many, by decontextualizing his ideas, began to associate his philosophy with brutality and immorality. This distorted concept is what became popular. Jean Delaunay's work was translated into Latin and English long before The Prince was available in these languages, and this negative Machiavellian view began to permeate popular culture. Over time, the Machiavellian archetype became a frequent presence in the arts, especially in theater and literature, associating Machiavelli's name with evil. However, what he actually argued was that Christian morality and political effectiveness do not always go hand in hand. Today, many would likely agree with this reflection, but at the time, his ideas were widely misunderstood. Machiavelli's philosophy, though always controversial, has been adopted by politicians from various parts of the world. His principles are not limited to good or bad leaders, authoritarian or permissive ones. In a way, his reflections anticipated or even shaped modern politics, accurately describing the strategies that govern the backstage of power. Nowadays, politicians still need to maintain an appearance of morality, and when possible, act according to those standards. However, it is undeniable that there is a clear disjunction between ethics and political ambitions. Regardless of ideology, regardless of one's political vision, it is hard to deny the truth of this observation. Personally, I never found the early discussions around Machiavelli particularly appealing. However, by analyzing his reflections, on life, the world, and how to act within it, one can perceive a timeless wisdom, a wisdom that, at times, we avoid facing. I acknowledge that many of Machiavelli's cynical ideas cause me resistance. I would never aspire to be like Cesare Borgia, nor would I want a leader like him. I firmly believe in the inherent goodness of people. However, I imagine that Machiavelli would mock this belief. He would say that I am letting myself be carried away by illusions, living according to an idealized vision of how the world should be and not how it really is. Machiavelli's writings possess an unwavering determination. He doesn't care about being virtuous, following religious principles, or maintaining personal relationships. His concern lies in one single issue: power. Although his approach may not be relevant to everyone, there is something admirable in that determination, even if it doesn't always apply to the daily lives of many. Like great villains, Machiavelli represents danger. Blindly following his ideas can be risky, but ignoring them completely may be equally dangerous.